Good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing today? So thanks for joining me for this session. I'm here to talk about enterprise data protection and the way we are solving some of the interesting data protection challenges in Windows 10. How many of you here attended the keynote? So you have seen both Joe Belfiore and Brad Anderson talk about data protection that we are introducing as part of Windows 10. So this session is going to go in depth about the data leak prevention capabilities that we are introducing. And I'll also spend some time talking about some of the improvements we have made in BitLocker as well. So let's get started. This is a slide you've probably seen if you've attended other security sessions at Ignite. We always start with the fact that today the security landscape is changing rapidly. We are in a world where the threats to data are at an all-time high. And we see that even with the best security solutions, the risks to data only keep going up. Now, what is interesting, though, is all that we hear in the news often is about external attacks. It's about data breaches that happened at Sony or Target. And what is interesting is the risk is often coming from within. Like, there are risks from external attacks, but just as much risk as there is from external attacks, there's a risk that comes from within. What do I mean by that? So what is actually interesting here is majority of the risks to data happen accidentally. How many of you here have accidentally sent an email to someone who was not supposed to receive that email just because they happen to be in your contact list? I see a few hands go up. Or you may have uploaded some enterprise documents to a public cloud because you put them in a folder that happened to sync with the public cloud. So today in the world we live in, it is often these honest mistakes that prove to be very expensive. Let me give you an example. Take a moment to read this. This is an article from about 6 weeks ago that was published in The Guardian. And this is a very interesting data point when we think about data leak prevention. So what happened here was at the G20 conference in Brisbane, Australia, you had one of the employees of the Australian Immigration Department. This person had access to personal details of some of the most powerful people in the world. We are talking about world leaders attending the summit, the president of the US, the prime minister of the UK, and so on. And just as part of business, he was supposed to be emailing this to a colleague of his. Instead, he ended up emailing this information to someone who was organizing a football tournament. I just wonder the reaction of the person who received that email. So you can see that an accidental mistake can be very expensive. Just an interesting tidbit about this particular incident, the reaction of the Australian Immigration Department was to ban autocomplete. So that was how they decided to respond to it. But this just illustrates that data leaks happen accidentally. I have a fun video to show some of the examples of this in an interesting context. So let's just play that. Can we get the audio going, please?
Most data leaks, they're not really intentional. I manage IT for Relic Cloud's marketing org, which is 450 seats. Like any place around, people just can make mistakes. They try to upload confidential documents onto personal cloud storage.
We're on mute, right? Yeah, I think so.
What I would like to say is that is the stupidest idea I have ever heard.
Hello?
And copy and paste business information that's really confidential onto the non-corporate sites. We needed a solution that could tell the difference between the personal documents and those really critical business documents that need to be protected. Because a lot of people around here, they just They don't think. Microsoft's enterprise data protection. I do sleep a little better. Just a little.
So if we did a Super Bowl commercial, that's what it would look like. So anyways, let's look at some hard numbers. We had the fun part of it, but this is from a survey that was done a couple of years ago. So the first data point is 87% of senior managers admit to regularly uploading work files to email or cloud accounts. Now the thing to note here is when this survey was done, this is the 87% that admitted to doing it. I'm sure the remaining 13% are not willing to admit it. As I said earlier, people often accidentally send data to the wrong person, and we have, again, survey results to show that this has happened more than half of the time. And the last data point, and I'm sure many of us are familiar with this, but once a data record is breached or leaked, the cost to the organization is very high. This is, I think, in the survey that was done in the context of healthcare industry. And you can see just per record, the cost is $240. So all of this just to illustrate the point that data leaks are very expensive and they can be accidental. How do we go about solving it? So when we think about this problem, we also look at what else is out there. And one of the things we notice is there's a set of data leak prevention solutions that focus on mobile devices. It is definitely an area of concern because on mobile devices, you can tend to leak data easily given the data is moving around a lot more. But it is just as important to have a data leak prevention solution on a domain joined or a corp-owned device. I mean, think about it. Many of us might be doing personal stuff even if the device is owned by the corporation. And so in those scenarios, we really don't know today how many solutions are focusing on that. So we wanted to come up with something that focuses on both the user-owned devices as well as the corporate-owned devices. So before we go into sort of how we are solving this problem, I just wanted to put this in the perspective of the overall data protection journey that we have. So there's really three parts to it. I'll talk about each one, and this will give you a big picture view of how we view the data protection and information protection problem. So the first part of this problem is the device protection. This is really the problem of protecting data on the device when it is lost or stolen. If you remember, if you were at TechEd or any other conference 10 years ago, this was the pitch we had for BitLocker. This is when you lose your laptop in the back of a cab and making sure that that data stays protected. So we have had BitLocker for about 10 years now, but really what we have done is we have made a lot of improvements to BitLocker with Windows 8.1 and even more so with Windows 10. Some of these improvements include the fact that we now support automatic device encryption on Instant Go devices. So any of you here using a Surface Pro 3, the moment you unboxed your Surface Pro 3 and you signed in with a Microsoft account, the device was actually protected using BitLocker and your recovery keys were uploaded to OneDrive. The beauty of this is for an end user, the protection is so automatic and so seamless, they don't need to worry about it. From an IT standpoint, we made improvements to provisioning, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. One of the things we have noticed with BitLocker is the trend now is going towards where we see third parties adopting BitLocker and deploying or providing management solutions on top of that rather than coming up with their own full volume encryption solutions. So we have definitely matured the device protection story. On the other end of the spectrum, we have protection of data when it moves around. How many folks here are familiar with rights management services? Good, I see a few hands go up. There was a good session on this a couple of days ago. I encourage you to look at it. So we have had rights management services as a solution to the problem of protecting data when it gets shared and applying rights to the data so that only certain actions can be performed on it. Again, that story has improved over the years. We now have an online Azure rights management solution that makes it really easy to deploy and use RMS. So we sort of take care of data protection at the device level, and we have protection of the data when it is shared. What, again, going back to sort of the crux of the problem we have here is the gap between these two is the accidental data leakage. And as we saw, that is a problem that needs to be addressed. We understand that there are third-party solutions in this space. This is a space that has got a lot of interest over the recent few years, but there are some gaps. So what are some of the gaps or the pain points with other solutions that we see in the market? And bear in mind, I'm presenting this from the view of how we approach this problem and why we took some of the steps we did to solve the problem. So one of the things we notice is a lot of the solutions today focus on an experience compromise. What that means is if you want to separate work and personal data, you need to often switch modes between something that is work and something that is personal. And that just becomes a hard-to-use experience over time, because as humans, we are wired to do multiple things at the same time, and it is hard to switch between modes. Some of the solutions in the market today require changing applications so that they work securely with enterprise data. This can become a challenge, and we heard from many of you that you have applications that are existing applications written years ago, and those applications really, it's very hard to go back and modify them just for the purposes of enterprise data. One of the other challenges we see is solutions, as I said, focus primarily on mobile devices, so the experiences are not really consistent when you move between a mobile device and a desktop device. And the last but not the least thing is some of these solutions are expensive, and part of that has to do with the fact that they are not integrated with the platform. So you need a platform, and then you need a solution that runs on top of it. So where this all really comes down to is when we think about a data protection solution, we need to find the right balance between something that maintains a great user experience, so users can still adopt this solution and use their enterprise services on their own devices, whereas also maintaining the cost and the deployment overhead low enough, so that is something that you can widely deploy. So that was the challenge we took on when we looked at this problem. And what we realized very soon is without integrating a solution in the platform itself, it is almost impossible to have the right balance between experience and the cost and deployment as well. So with that, I'm going to talk about our vision. The way I'm going to structure this session is I'm going to spend some time talking about how we solve the problem. I'll go through a bunch of data flows, and then I'll spend some time demonstrating the feature, and I'll take questions at the end. So our vision, and this is really bringing back some of the things that I've been saying, but the vision here is to integrate data protection at the platform level. That is very important. We wanted to make sure the entire platform, not just the file system, not just the networking stack, not just the shell, but the entire platform is enterprise data aware. And the vision here is we want to integrate it in such a way that we can protect the enterprise data against disclosure to unauthorized applications, unauthorized endpoints, so that this data does not leak to email, cloud, some of the examples that we saw earlier. So when we looked at the set of requirements that this problem presents to us, one of the things that became clear to us is today your devices are a cache for the cloud. World has changed a lot in the last 10 years, right? Like back in the early 2000s, a lot of data would reside just on the device, whether that's your laptop or the workstation. Today, most of the data resides in the cloud, or it moves between multiple devices. All of the people who are attending this conference have at least a phone and a laptop or a tablet that they're carrying with them. So one of the things we see is when we protect data, it is not sufficient to just protect data on the device. It needs to be protected everywhere, across devices, in the cloud, and it needs to remain protected as it moves. We need to make sure that when we provide data protection, we also have a management story that allows you to wipe the information when needed, and it needs to be wiped in a selective manner such that only the enterprise data gets wiped. And then last but not the least, the biggest requirement here is making sure that the data protection solution is supported by all the applications that you use in the enterprise, and it is fully integrated, so there are no gaps in the experience. So how are we doing that? What are some of the key tenets we have for the enterprise data protection features that we are introducing with Windows 10? So number one, as I said, making sure that the data stays protected at rest and when it roams. Number two, I mentioned the experience challenges with mode switching. So we have a solution that is platform integrated and that does not have any mode switching. The user can use their device the same way they do today, and there is really no experience compromise. Making sure that the corporate data is identifiable from personal. Again, this is something that is fairly obvious once we look at the problem of selective wipe. How can we make sure only the corporate data is wiped if we cannot identify what is corporate or personal? So that's an important goal of what we are doing here. Making sure only IT-allowed applications have access to business data. So I talked about the problem of data leaking to applications and endpoints that are outside your control. How do you control that? So the way you control that is by ensuring that only the applications that you want to have access to your data have access to your data, and we are enabling that as part of Windows 10. Control of the keys. This is super important. We often get feedback about, well, data protection is great, but who is controlling the keys? In case of enterprise data, we want to make sure that the enterprise that owns the data is controlling the keys. Because the reality of encryption is encryption reduces a data access problem to a key access problem. So as soon as you have control of the keys, that's how you control the data. And I mentioned remote wipe earlier. So we are integrating with a management story here that allows you to provide a remote wipe for your data in case you need it. And then the last but not the least thing is common experience. And I'll reiterate this point a few times in my session, but cross-platform support. If you have attended some other sessions throughout the week here, we have data protection that is now available on iOS and Android. And one of the things that we strive to do was to make sure that the experience is a common experience across what we provide on Windows and what our partners in Intune are providing on those other platforms. And the story doesn't end there. Data that you protect on Windows is going to flow to other devices, whether those devices are running iOS or Android or even older operating systems from Windows, such as Windows 7. So we need to have a story that makes sure that the data remains protected even when it lands on those devices. So this is something that you may have heard in sessions earlier, and this is some of the tenets we have with data protection. We didn't stop there. So we have extra security with data protection under lock. Are there any government customers here? Anybody in the government sector? So one of the things that we hear very strongly, especially from the government sector, is around protecting data on the device when it is locked. This is a special class of attacks that customers care about, which has to do with, consider a phone that you have today. When you lock your phone, because of the fact that the phone is still running, the BitLocker keys, even if your phone is protected with BitLocker, are still in memory. So if a sophisticated attacker manages to steal the phone and get to those keys in memory, then your data is still at risk. So what we are providing, in addition to just baseline data protection, is there's an optional policy that you have to enable protection under lock. How does that work? What we do is essentially rely on asymmetric cryptography, asymmetric key cryptography. We protect the data and toss the decryption key on lock. What that means is when the device is locked, all of the data is cryptographically inaccessible to an attacker, even if they are running malware on the device and even if they are trying to get access to the key. Now, this does have a few other associated effects. As soon as the decryption key is tossed, the system is not going to be able to read any of the enterprise data under lock. So there will be a trade-off in terms of the experience. And what we have done here is to make sure that all of the personal experience remain as they were before, and only the enterprise data is unreadable. Now, we did not want to completely block the experience of the user. One of the big advantages of locking a phone is it definitely saves on power, but you can still get new email. You can still sync new email. So we can maintain that ability even with this feature. And the way we do that is, again, the decryption key or the private key is not available, but the public key is still available. So you can encrypt any of the new files that come in. So you can imagine if you get calendar invite or a new email while your phone was locked, that will still be returned to the device, it will still be protected, and it will be available for you so the experience is not impacted. And then when the user logs on, we basically use the logon credential to derive the keys again, and you have access to all of your data. So as I said, this is mitigating a class of attacks that are more sophisticated than accidental leaks. This is a special policy, but I just want to call out that this is definitely part of our story on the mobile devices, and this is something we have heard feedback from government customers, but as you evaluate this, you may find this is useful in your organization as well. So next what I'm going to do is I'm just going to walk through some of the data flows. What I always like to do is when we think about protecting data, it's always good to look at the life cycle of data, look at how the data is flowing, and making sure how we protect it at each stage in the life cycle. So let's get started. The first step is how you provision your device. Right, so I briefly mentioned this earlier. One of the key requirements for enterprise data protection is that you have a management solution, because the management solution is what is going to enable you to deploy policies. So what happens is, in a very common workflow, the user is bringing in their device and they are enrolling that device with an MDM solution. It could be Microsoft Intune, or it could be some other MDM solution, or they could be using Config Manager. One of the things to note here is this is going to support both domain joined machines as well as non-domain joined machines, because we are supporting Config Manager as part of our story. So when you enroll your device, the MDM or the Config Manager is going to provision policy and a set of keys. Now, what are these policies that I'm talking about? So this really boils down to a set of 3 policies. The first set of policies is the list of allowed applications. So when you look at this problem space, what I encourage you to do is to think about which applications would have access to enterprise data. These could be applications that you have written, like your line of business applications, or these could be applications that are productivity applications that are used in your enterprise, such as Office, Adobe Reader, and so on. The second set of policies is network policies. So again, the goal here is to make sure we are defining an enterprise boundary and making sure data stays protected in that boundary. So the way we do that is ensuring that we have an understanding of what the enterprise network looks like. So again, what you would do here is you would define what your network looks like. In a few minutes, I will actually show you what the experience for configuring these policies looks like, and that would help you appreciate this a little bit better. The last thing here is application restriction policies. Some of you said you saw the keynote earlier in the week, and in the keynote, Brad Anderson showed what happens when a user tries to copy enterprise data to a document or an application that is not enterprise. So the way that works is you, as an IT professional, is going to go into the console and define the application restriction policy. You're going to say, I want to block data flow between enterprise applications and non-enterprise applications. Or you might say, I want to allow the data to flow, but with an override. Again, we'll see some of this in action a little bit later, but this is just to illustrate the set of policies we have. One thing to think about when I'm talked about applications is how do you differentiate between which applications are line of business and which applications are dual purpose applications. So the way we solve that problem, again, the goal being ensuring a good experience, is dual purpose productivity applications are enlightened to support enterprise data protection. What that means is these applications are using our SDK, they're using our APIs to make sure when they're processing enterprise data, the policies apply. When they're processing personal data, the policies do not apply. So here's a view of what the world looks like. On one hand, you have certain applications that are exclusively for business. These are line of business applications, or applications such as Lync or Skype for Business that are purely for business use. On the other hand, there are certain applications that are personal only. You can think of an application such as Facebook or Angry Birds. That application has no business dealing with your business information. But what's in between are applications that sort of span the work versus personal. And these are the applications that will use our SDK and make sure that they are protecting and applying policy to enterprise data. We are working actively to get all of the key productivity applications as part of our Enlightened applications list. So you will have universal Windows applications such as universal Word, Excel, PowerPoint, the core Office applications, as well as the browser. And we are also working with a set of ISVs so that we have a story that spans some of the common productivity applications that you use. One thing that I would ask here is if you can provide feedback on applications that are commonly used in your organizations that will help us make sure those applications are ready for the enterprise data protection story. But again, for your line of business apps, no changes required. They can be part of this story simply as they are today. Okay, so you have defined policy. This is great. The user has enrolled their device. Now, to make sure data stays protected, it is important to protect it when it comes down to the device. I'll demonstrate this a little bit later, but just to explain, what we do is applications that bring data down to the device, such as Outlook, such as OneDrive for Business, will make sure that the data is encrypted on the device. So the file that comes down to the device is now protected. Now what happens once it's on the device? You're using that application, and you're basically writing the file to the disk. So we have a few ways in which we ensure that data stays protected when it is in use on the device. Number one, you can apply protection to a folder. How many folks here are familiar with a feature we have called work folders? I see a few hands go up. So work folders is a feature that we have shipped, and what that does is it allows you to basically specify a particular folder as an enterprise folder. And work folders is actually using the APIs that we have as part of the Enterprise Data Protection SDK, and that ensures if you drop a new file in that folder, protection is automatically applied. The user doesn't have to think about it. It's all enterprise. We also give the user an option to save something as corporate. So imagine you are working with a vendor, and the vendor gives you some files that are not enterprise tagged. They came from a USB drive. You have the ability to tag those files either from the experience itself or when you go to save them in the Save As dialog. As I mentioned earlier, you can configure line of business applications to automatically protect data, and then Enlightened applications or dual purpose applications will protect data. So we protect data as it comes in, we protect data as it leaves applications and gets stored on the disk. What about data that leaves the device? So this is one of the most challenging pieces with data protection. How do you make sure protection stays with the data when it leaves the device? So I mentioned we have network policy. What the network policy allows us to do is to block data from leaving to a non-enterprise site. So again, if you have defined your corporate boundary as corp.contoso.com, then any location that is outside that boundary, the data will not leak to it. Within applications, we have the app restriction policy. I talked about copy, paste, and drag and drop, and some of the other scenarios where we maintain that protection. I'll show demos of that in a little bit. And last but not the least, cross-platform data sharing. So the way we are solving this problem from a technology standpoint is we are leveraging the work that has been done in the rights management services space, the RMS space. So what happens is when you have a file that you store on a USB drive or in the cloud, it actually gets converted to a RMS file. So that could be an IRM protected file in case of Office files, or it could be a P file, a protected file in case of other file formats. There are readers available for these file formats on all platforms, on iOS, Android, Windows 7, and we have a public API available for anybody to integrate with that. There is also the Microsoft Intune SDK for iOS and Android. So as I said earlier, the story that we have on Windows extends to iOS and Android. You have similar policies and protections available by virtue of that. And so even from a developer standpoint, there's a common experience because the SDK is fairly well aligned among all the platforms. So As you can see, the goal here is to give the best-in-class experience on Windows, but also understanding the fact that in your organization, users are bringing in other devices and data is flowing between these devices. We have a story that covers the end-to-end. And last but not the least, what happens when the data gets revoked? We see this when users leave the company or they change a job, and what we do is an unenroll action will remove the keys, and that will make the enterprise data inaccessible. There will be a cleanup agent running on the system, which will delete the files later on so we can reclaim the space. So as you can see, overall, from the point data comes down to the device, it stays on the device, it leaves the device, we are ensuring that the data stays protected and policies apply. I think this is a good time to get into some demos, so I'm going to shift to my demo machine. All right. So the demo is going to mirror some of the data flows that I talked about. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk about this machine. This is a personal machine. I signed in with my Microsoft account. This machine is currently enrolled in an Intune MDM solution. And what I have here is there's a set of policies that have been set on this machine. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to an enterprise SharePoint site, and I'm going to save a file. So I download this file, and I'm going to save it to my downloads folder. As you can see, this file is encrypted. If anyone here is familiar with EFS, we use the sort of the green color coding for EFS files. But what we have done with Windows 10 is we have added basically a description of who is the management authority for this file. So in my case, the Intune tenant is using Microsoft.com as the enterprise ID. In your organization, you would use Contoso.com, Fabricam.com. This is the enterprise ID, or this is the management authority that is protecting this file. So as you can see, this file is protected as soon as it comes down to the device. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is try to move this file around and show you how the protection persists. So let me take this file from the downloads folder to the documents folder, because I rarely work in the downloads folder. And it turns out I had a file there, so I'm just going to override it. So what you can see here is the file was copied over to the documents folder, but the protection stayed with the file. Now, one of the challenges we see with data protection is data stays protected on the device, but users move the data to a USB drive or an SD card. Up until Windows 10, basically in earlier versions of Windows, we could not support, or we did not support, file level encryption on the FAT file system, which is what is used by SD cards and USB drives. So for the first time in Windows, we now have that support. I'm going to show you that right here. So I'm going to take this file, and I'm going to copy it. And I have a removable drive here. It's a personal drive. As you can see, nothing is encrypted. And I'm going to paste it. You can notice that there is really no change to the file. The file is still protected. It is stored here. The protection persists. Why is this important? You can ask me, why not use BitLocker to go and just protect everything? Well, it doesn't work in many scenarios. One of the common problems we hear is users using their own SD cards. And what people do is they have cameras on which they use the SD card, and then they'll bring that SD card and stick it in their Surface, and that's how they'll move photos around. Once you enable BitLocker to go on that SD card, it's not going to work in the camera anymore because it's supporting full volume encryption. So with per file encryption, we can solve that problem. They can still use their SD card. They can still have personal information there that is not impacted by enterprise policy. But when your data lands on that device, it stays protected and the protection persists. So you can see just simply moving files around, the user didn't have to think. The experience was seamless and the protection was maintained. Now let's go back to the documents folder and talk about a few other scenarios. So I talked about protection being applied to the files in such a way that only certain applications can open those files. So let's see that in action. In my configuration here, an application WordPad is not on the allow list. So I'm going to go to my file here and try to open it with WordPad. As you can see, because WordPad was an application that was not on the allow list, that application got an access denied. Just to give you a little bit of depth into how we are doing this, how many folks here are familiar with AppLocker? Great. So I see a few of you have used AppLocker and deployed AppLocker. AppLocker is a technology we have had for a few releases now that allows you to restrict which applications can run in your environment. What we have done here is taken AppLocker and we have taken EFS, the per file encryption, and we have integrated those two technologies in a unique way. So what is actually happening when I try to open that file is the file system is not only checking whether the file is encrypted or not, but it is also checking whether the application that is trying to access the file is an allowed application using AppLocker. And only if it is, it will get access. If it is not, it's going to get an access denied. Now, the thing to note here is, from an experience standpoint, we are not going to impact anything that the user does on the device for personal purposes. So just to illustrate that, I have a cookie recipe, and I'm going to open that with WordPad. So I wouldn't recommend using that as a recipe. It's just something I was putting together. But the idea here is you can open this personal file with WordPad. There was no impact to the experience. And I can still go back to my enterprise file. And because Word happens to be an app that my IT admin said is allowed, I can open it here. So you can see the experience just flows naturally. The user is not really impacted with the applications that they use, and you are assured that your applications, the ones that you want to be accessing the data, are the only ones that get access. Now, that's great. Let's now talk about a few of the scenarios that we have seen in demos earlier, but I'll go into a little bit more depth. So one of the things we have talked about is copy-paste. At least the data that we have seen, it happens to be a fairly common action by which data can leak through honest mistakes. And I'm a strong believer, people are going to make honest mistakes unless you are Tom Brady and you are deflating footballs. I hope I don't see any Patriot fans here. So anyways, I'm going to illustrate a very common workflow that happens when you copy paste. So I don't need to say this, but I'm a Seahawks fan coming from Seattle. We had a great draft here in Chicago. So I'm going to tweet about it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this and I want to paste it to Twitter. But I also happen to be working on this document, and my colleague just pinged me that they wanted a paragraph from here. So I wanted to send that to them over IM. So I copy something here. Now, what often happens while you're working is you don't realize that what was the last thing you copied was actually enterprise information. So I may believe that I was about to paste something to Twitter, and I may go here and try to paste. What you see here is enterprise data protection in action. The thing to note is this dialog showed up because my system was configured to have an override prompt when data flowed between enterprise and personal. The way we are actually solving this is when you put content on the clipboard, when an application puts content on the clipboard, we are enlightening the clipboard. So if it comes from an enterprise application, the clipboard is going to tag that as enterprise data. That's how we know when you make a paste action, the target application is not an enterprise application, so the system is going to prompt. In this case, I can choose to override the prompt. If I do that, the information will paste, but there will be an audit log generated that will be eventually sent back to the MDM server. So imagine on your IT console, you can collect all these audit logs and understand how data is flowing in your organization. I don't want to tweet about some sensitive stuff here, so I'm going to cancel out of this. Now, the beauty of this is if the user were to paste into another enterprise document, so let's say I was doing this and I wanted to copy paste into a new document I'm working on, the data just pasted fine. So you can imagine as users use this technology, their experience impact is going to be minimal. They're not going to see those prompts unless they cross the boundary, which they shouldn't be in any case. And if they're working in the enterprise boundary and copy pasting between enterprise documents, things will continue to work. And similar to that is if they're copy pasting between personal documents. So copy paste is one scenario. What about drag and drop? So let's go back to the other document here. And let's go back to the WordPad that I had open. And I'll just try to take something here and drag and drop, right? Similar experience, it's almost the same technology, except it's doing the enlightenment for a different part of the system. So what we have done here is we have taken care of the network stack. You saw the integration with the networking stack when I downloaded from SharePoint. Here we are integrating with the clipboard and the drag and drop stack to have the same level of protection. I'm going to cancel out of that and illustrate yet another scenario. So I have a enterprise picture here. And if I try to share that, again, this is a common scenario. You might be sharing pictures or other types of files, and you might be wanting to send that over email, but we show you a list of apps, and you accidentally pick Facebook. The system is smart enough to detect that the content that was in the that was being shared, that was in the data package, was enterprise, and it's going to override. You have the ability to say you want to block this completely, in which case the user will not even see a prompt to override. So all of this is great in terms of how the data is protected, and I showed you the Word application, which as we speak is being enlightened to use our APIs. But what happens to line of business apps? I have been saying that those applications don't need to be changed. So how does that actually work? So what I have here is a line of business application, and I'm going to just restart that. So this is a line of business application that we use in Microsoft. It's the threat modeling tool. I work in the security team, so I do a lot of threat models. But I certainly don't do threat models for fun. I only do threat models for work. So the first thing you will see when I launch this application is there's a warning that shows up. This is a warning that is telling the user that this is an enterprise-only application. It's going to encrypt any of the files that it's going to create on the device. Now, when I start this application and I start creating files, you will notice something. So I'll start creating a file, but I'm not going to spend all this time on creating a threat model here. So if I go to save this, let's just call it a new threat model 2, because I was just showing this in an earlier session today. What you will see is this is protected to Microsoft.com. Just by virtue of the fact that the file was created from within an enterprise application, it's going to automatically derive that protection. And you can see here when I go back to the documents folder, the file here was generated and protected to Microsoft.com. So as you can see, we have taken care of applications that are enlightened to call our APIs, as well as any line of business apps you have that are not using the APIs. Just to give you a glimpse into how the auditing works, I'm going to show you an example of an audit log. So one of the things that we support is the ability for the user to change the encryption status on a file. So as I said, there could be scenarios where, let's say you upgraded or you brought in files from another source, you can go ahead, right-click on the file and choose to encrypt it. Or if you accidentally ended up encrypting a personal document, you can right-click on the file and decrypt it. So if that happens, what we do is we capture an audit event. I'm just going to show you what it looks like as soon as it comes up here. So what you can see is the audit log is capturing information about the action that was performed. In this case, the enterprise tag was removed from the file. Now, this is what was captured locally, but this information is going to be transferred over to the MDM server, and we'll have a reporting structure available for you. So when you look at this from a console, from your administration console, you will be able to see what kind of actions are happening, and you can choose to respond to those actions. So let me now show you what the console looks like. Yeah.
You forward such an encrypted file to a colleague of you who is running Windows 8.1 and tries to open it.
So if you copied it to a Windows 8.1, right, this is basically, if I took this USB drive that I put the file on, it will show up as a P file. So basically, you will still be able to open it, but you will have to authenticate, and you will have to use a reader on those platforms. So somebody who doesn't have the credentials to access the file will not be able to access the file. It will remain encrypted. So I have switched over to the Intune experience. This was deployed just last week. So this is for the first time we are showing this at this conference. And I'm just going to walk through a few aspects of this experience, and you will see how this all ties back to the policies that we have been talking about. So the first thing here to notice is this is just part of, how many folks here use Microsoft Intune? All right, I see a few hands go up. We are also working with other MDM providers, so you can imagine the experience will look similar when this all comes together. But this is similar to how you would configure other policies in Intune. You would go to configuration policies, create a new enterprise data protection policy. So the first thing you will see is a list of applications. In this demo configuration, you can see some applications have been put on the list. Just to give you an example, the Microsoft Threat Modeling tool that I used is configured as an enterprise-only application, and that's what is really defining that application will protect all its data. You can add or delete applications as you choose, and those applications will be treated as enterprise. We also have ability to tell you if the application is enlightened. Enlightenment really means using our SDK to call the APIs, so the application is enterprise data aware, and an application can declare it's enlightened through capabilities.
So if you make, for instance, Office a protected application, are you able to use it on non-protected data?
You are. So the way Office works, Office in this case is an enlightened application. And what that means is it can work on both enterprise and non-enterprise data, and it will apply policies accordingly. I would recommend, there was a talk done at the Build conference last week, which was developer focused, that talked about our APIs and how they can be used. So if you happen to have applications that handle both personal and enterprise data, I do recommend looking at that talk and learning about our API set. So the next thing here is the application management mode. I'll spend some time on this. You saw the experience I had on my device where I was getting an override prompt when I tried to copy, paste, or drag and drop. That was because in my configuration, the option that was set was the override option there. You can also choose to set the block option. What that means is data is not going to flow at all. If the user tries any action, they'll be blocked and they'll have no chance to override. The reason override is interesting is because there are legitimate business scenarios where you might need to post enterprise data to a non-enterprise application. One example I always use is that of a marketing manager. They might be working on a brand campaign and they may have enterprise data that needs to be posted to Twitter. In that case, what is going to happen is even though the user overrides, you will have the audit log available. So if that you detect that and you realize that was not a legitimate business need, you can take action. The third option we have there is silent. This is really what we see as being very useful to you as you start trying out this feature and deploying it in your environment. What silent does is it's still going to apply the same set of policies, but it's not going to block the data from flowing. So if I were to do copy paste, it would just go normally, but will audit all that. So think about it in a way of it will help you to realize how data is flowing in your organization. And depending on what you see, you can tweak these policies to override or block. So silent will really help you get started and learn about the kind of data leaks that are happening in your organization. Then what we have is a set of network policies. This is, as I said earlier, allows you to define your network boundary. We are working closely with the VPN folks. There was a talk done earlier today. And what this allows us to do is to say, anything that is defined here is considered as an enterprise network, and that is what is defining the boundary when data comes in or goes out. So you saw when I downloaded a file from the SharePoint site, it was considered as enterprise because that site was configured as an enterprise network location. We allow you to specify IP addresses as well as domain names, so it's really your choice how you configure this. And there's a few other policies here. I encourage you to take a look at this when this is available in the TAP program, but we also sort of support the data recovery certificate, which is, if you're familiar with EFS, a data recovery certificate is something that allows you to recover the data in case the keys are not available for some reason. So, go ahead.
So you showed the copy paste.
Yep.
Also integrate screen capture.
So screen captures are not part of our what we are thinking as the first version of the Windows 10 solution, but it is something that we look at adding in the future. So this is a good data point for us to go back and add to our solution. It's not part of our V1. It is. So that's what I was going to get to next is when we talk about data protection roaming, when the data leaves, the way we achieve that is by integrating with RMS. I mentioned that the file itself is a P file, but the key management is RMS. So we have two choices for you. If you have RMS deployed, then you can enable protected roaming and sharing, and the data is going to roam, and it's going to roam leveraging the RMS key management. Or you could just use the inbuilt local key management system, in which case the data will stay protected on that device, but roaming and sharing scenarios will not be supported until you have an RMS integration available in your environment. So it is optional, but it is something that enables a broader set of DLP scenarios. So I'll repeat the question. I realized I was not doing that. So for the audience, so the question is, if I have an application that has both an enterprise document and a personal document open at the same time, how does that work? So the way we are actually solving that is the application, in this case, let's say Word, which is Enlighten, which supports work and personal, is smart enough to only apply protection on the enterprise document. Our API set allows you to say, this document or this set of data that I'm working on is enterprise. So the application calls an API that basically tells the system this is enterprise. We apply a set of policies. On the personal document, that does not happen. So this is not happening at a process-wide level. It is happening at essentially, you can think of it as the application is calling an API when they are dealing with data. So that actually allows us to support that exact scenario, and it will be supported in both the universal Word application as well as desktop Word when that integration happens, but it's already in the works.
Same cannot be done on a third-party application. You need to work on enterprise data as well as the personal data.
So that third-party application, the example you are giving, would need to be enlightened to basically call that same API that we are using in Word. It's basically an API that tells the system, hey, I'm dealing with enterprise data, go apply policy, and we will do the right thing. So yes, the application does need to call our APIs, but this is where if you have specific applications in mind, that feedback will be really, really helpful. Sorry, could you repeat the question? It does apply to all users, so it's not specific to, it's not specific to whether you are, sorry, to repeat the question was if your local admin, do the rules still apply? Yes, they do apply. It's not just for standard users, they apply to both types of users. Yeah, so the question is, how do we know how to display that the file is protected to Microsoft.com in my example? So what we do is when we encrypt the file, there is actually some metadata in the header of the file that contains that information. And when we roam the file, this is where when we basically convert it to, let's say, a protected file, that metadata travels with the file. So that's how we know which enterprise ID it is protected to. So I'm just trying to understand, when you say sidestep, what exactly are you referring to?
Within if you have the domain, the desktop is locked down, and general policy is if you are uploading files from within your managed to like SharePoint or something, depending upon the load, you either turn on your malware checks or not. So I was just wondering if this is one more way to use the metadata.
I think, so the question is, can malware solutions leverage some of this information? I think that is definitely possible. how about we talk a little bit later about how that can be done? I think that's a longer conversation, but yes, it is possible. So the question is, can device encryption and this solution coexist? Yes. So this is file level encryption. Device encryption is full volume encryption. So they both coexist. In fact, the machines that I'm using right now have both BitLocker and the file level. Oh, EFS encryption. So this is EFS. So actually the thing that I have been pointing out is this is leveraging EFS. So it's basically, if you are already using EFS, it's the same technology that we are using for EDP, except that the key management is a little bit different because the keys are different. So the technologies are the same. All right, let's get back to the presentation. So, yeah. Yep. So maybe I can show you, but there's actually a different talk that was done. So in the interest of time, so what you can see is, okay. So the question was, what about policies on other platforms such as iOS and Android? And in Intune, so what I'll do actually is I'll point you to, there was a talk done on how we support protection on iOS and Android. And there was a talk done by the Office 365 MDM data protection as well. So similar to the policy set I showed, if you go to the configuration policy, there's a set of policies that you can configure for iOS and Android. One of the things that is unique to Windows is the ability to override, because that is integrated in the platform. So on iOS and Android, you can either block or allow access. Only on Windows do we support override. But you can look at those solutions, and I'm happy to point you to some documentation that we have about iOS configuration policy. So you can see here there's like iOS data leak prevention policy and so on. All right, let's get back to the talk. I do want to spend a few minutes talking about BitLocker and some of the feedback that I keep hearing from folks like you. So as we discussed, we talked about accidental data leakage, but what about BitLocker? You know, Windows 10, our focus has certainly been on the data leak prevention problem, but we haven't lost sight of, you know, BitLocker and some of the challenges that folks face when it comes to deploying and using BitLocker. We had a great session yesterday on how MBAM is improving BitLocker deployment. If you didn't attend that, I encourage you to look at the video. So I talked about device encryption. Let me spend a few more minutes on that. So what we did in Windows 8 was we introduced device encryption. The idea was to essentially enable BitLocker for consumers. 10 years ago, when we introduced BitLocker, it was an enterprise-only play. It was meant really to make sure enterprise data stays protected on devices that are lost or stolen. We realized soon enough that consumers also care about their data, and we really need to be a consumer solution that needs to be seamless. So with device encryption, we have encryption that is automatic out of the box. If you have a Surface Pro 3, as I said, you have this as soon as you sign in with a Microsoft account, and a recovery password is escrowed in OneDrive. The big thing about device encryption is it is available in all editions of Windows, including the core edition. The only thing to call out is it does have some hardware requirements, primarily around the availability of a TPM and secure boot binding. So right now it is primarily available on devices that support Instant Go. BitLocker and BitLocker 2 Go, I think that's probably something familiar to this audience, so I'll just quickly recap. We have full management capabilities, including FIPS support, and in Windows 8, we simplified the provisioning story for BitLocker. So you could use MBAM. We also have a pre-provisioning story, so you could enable BitLocker as part of your setup, or the end user can enable protection. Again, we support recovery key escrow to AD or via MBAM, and BitLocker remains a premium feature, so it is available in the Pro and Enterprise editions. Let's spend some time talking about the provisioning and enhancements we have done for BitLocker. So again, I'm keeping this really brief because of in the interest of time, I encourage you to look at, we have tons of documentation available, but just some of the key points with provisioning is we now have the ability to auto-provision the TPM, meaning that out of the box, the TPM comes provisioned. The user doesn't have to do an extra reboot or take extra steps for this. With Windows 8, we added support for encrypting hard drives. So if you have a hard drive that is compatible with our requirements, then we will use the hardware encryption. We added support for used disk space only encryption. The idea was we realized that a lot of the new devices that the users were encrypting, they were taking a long time, and we had an opportunity to improve that. So with used disk space only, this is recommended for new devices which are low on data. We sort of encrypt the used disk space. It's quicker from an encryption and provisioning standpoint. And then we have pre-provisioning that is available during the setup and imaging. So let's talk a little bit about the experience improvements. We did a lot of work through the Windows hardware certification program. We have a set of certification requirements. We work closely with the top OEMs to improve the BitLocker experience overall. So compare and contrast this with Windows 7 and some of the challenges you may have had with users hitting recovery. That problem has been mitigated to a great extent. With automatic device encryption, we actually now have introduced what we call a secure boot binding with something that is known as PCR7. It's a TPM register that allows us to use secure boot for integrity purposes, and that reduces some of the risks in terms of recovery events, and the experience is much better. One thing I'll spend a little bit of time on is pre-boot authentication. This is probably the biggest area of feedback when it comes to BitLocker, is around pre-boot auth and the fact that, customers ask us, should I use a PIN, should I not use a PIN? So I'll spend some time on that. So we do have improved anti-hammering for signing on. So what does this mean? So one of the things we did with Windows 8 was we added support for a feature called device lock. What device lock does is when you are using a BitLocker protected device, if you type in the wrong password or the wrong credential a few times, the device is not going to wipe itself. It's not going to reset. Instead, it's going to go into BitLocker recovery. So this gives us an advantage over some other devices out in the market where accidental password entry can cause the entire data to be wiped. Instead, in this case, the data remains secure, and the user can recover it using their BitLocker recovery key. We added support for a one-time suspend. Again, if you have used Windows 8, you will be familiar with this, but we removed some of the risks associated with suspending BitLocker, especially as part of upgrading. We do a one-time suspend, so the device automatically resumes protection when it comes back, and you don't need to worry about device remaining suspended and the users not being protected. And we also have integration with EAS and MDM for device encryption. Go ahead. Yep. So I'll repeat the question. So in case of device encryption, the keys go back to OneDrive, and your question is, so is the check really the password to OneDrive? So the access to the recovery key requires 2FA. So you need to have a second factor in addition to your password. And I'll also talk about how we are improving that story with Windows 10 in a couple of minutes. So this is where, as I said earlier, I want to talk about this for a couple of minutes. Protecting devices with pre-boot auth. So in general, we keep hearing this feedback a lot, which is the best way you can secure protection of a volume is by implementing pre-boot authentication. And there are challenges with that just in terms of the experience and having to enter a PIN or some other credential in pre-boot. So let's look at that problem. In the past, we have had attacks that actually made this a necessary requirement. There were attacks when encryption keys were loaded in system memory. Some of these attacks might be familiar to you as you have worked in this space. There's cold boot attacks that allow you to get access to the keys in memory, or there are memory remnants attacks, again, of similar nature. So one of the things that we looked at is the class of devices that are called Instant Go devices and some of the new capabilities that they provide. So these devices have certain capabilities that did not exist on some of the older devices that we used to see. So let me go over those a little bit. So the DMA ports are restricted. We have a Windows hardware certification requirement that if you are shipping an Instant Go device, then the DMA ports need to be disabled. So all of the tablets you have, all of the even the Surface devices, this is mitigated. The attacks through DMA is mitigated. The other thing we have is on these devices, on some of the tablets, just the way they are architected, it's harder to get to the memory. So some of the frozen memory attacks are much harder just by the nature of the device. We have some nice white papers we have written about this. Just recently, we published a white paper on BitLocker countermeasures. I encourage you to look at this, and if you still have questions about pre-boot auth, do send us those questions our way. But this is an area we have definitely made a lot of improvements with Windows 8 and beyond. Lastly, let's talk about some of the improvements in Windows 10. So as I said, we haven't completely stopped looking at BitLocker. It is still an area we keep investing in it. So in terms of pre-boot authentication, I mentioned the work we did on Instant Go devices earlier. With Windows 10, we actually have now a behavior which disallows the hot plug DMA ports until the user signs in and when the device is locked. So what this allows us to do is all the way until the user signs in, the DMA port is disabled. And as soon as you lock the device, if the DMA port was not in use, we are going to turn it off again. So that's going to mitigate attacks that leverage that port. In Windows 10, we are introducing automatic device encryption with Azure Active Directory. So Windows 8 used to support automatic device encryption with Microsoft account, and that support continues to exist. But what we have with Windows 10 is if you sign into your device with Azure Active Directory, then we take those keys and we escrow them in Azure Active Directory. So how many of you here are familiar with the Azure Active Directory sign-in to Windows? So I see a few hands go up. There were sessions on this at this conference, and I have links in the back of the deck. What we are doing with Windows 10 is just like MSA is a first-class credential that can be used to sign in, so is your Azure Active Directory credential. And because we have integrated BitLocker, we now have the ability to take the password and escrow it to AAD. So in your environment, you can take control of those passwords even on devices that are not domain joined. We are introducing support for VMs. This is a big enhancement when it comes to BitLocker. There is sorry, go ahead.
All of this you're doing in Intune. Now, is this going to be available on 2012 R2 server or the next version of server, or is it just available with Azure?
So the Azure Active Directory piece is just available with Azure as long as you have Windows 10. So that doesn't have any specific server requirements. It's just as long as you have Azure Active Directory in your environment, that's going to work. The virtual TPM piece, that's definitely going to be part of the latest version of the Hyper-V and Windows 10 deployment. And the last thing here is it's a small improvement, but we believe it will be really useful, is on Windows Phone or on Windows Mobile, we have not had the ability to manually enable encryption. We heard some feedback that there are users who are not using MDM or EAS, so we gave them an option to do that as well. So with that, we are really sort of covered the spectrum from data protection at the device level, data protection with data leaks and the enterprise data protection work, and then the work that is going on in the RMS space when data gets shared. So in terms of next steps, I'm just going to answer what are some of the common questions I get. When can I try this out on Windows 10? So I encourage you to talk to your TAP buddy. We are going to be available in TAP soon, and that's how you can try out the enterprise data protection enhancements. I saw a few hands go up for Microsoft Intune. I believe others are using other management solutions. So please talk to your MDM vendors about Windows 10 support so we can build a good end-to-end story. And there's a set of sessions here at Ignite that talk about some of the technologies that I referenced briefly in my session. So I do encourage you to take a look at these videos. We are at the end of the week, but you can definitely look at the video and learn more about these technologies. So with that, I'm going to open up for questions. Thank you.